In the early 16th century, England was ruled by a king who loved three things with almost supernatural enthusiasm: hunting, music, and changing his mind. This king was Henry VIII, and during the 1520s and 1530s, he transformed England politically, religiously, and emotionally, mostly because he became obsessed with a woman named Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn has been remembered in many ways over the centuries. To some, she was a scheming temptress. To others, she was a brilliant political reformer trapped in a vicious court. To modern historians, she appears increasingly as an intelligent and ambitious woman navigating one of the most dangerous royal courts in European history. And somewhere amid the executions, the diplomatic crises, the theological arguments, and the king's collapsing marriages, there was also a small dog named Purkoy. The existence of Purkoy often surprises people because Tudor England does not immediately feel like a world designed for tiny companion dogs. The Tudor court was loud, violent, deeply unhygienic, and full of political tension. Men carried swords casually. Noble families destroyed one another over property disputes. Disease swept through royal palaces with alarming regularity, yet people still adored their pets. In fact, the Tudor obsession with dogs was immense. Anne Boleyn's little dog Purkoy appears in several contemporary references and portraits associated with Anne's circle. Purkoy's story actually began before the little dog ever reached Anne Boleyn. The lapdog had originally belonged to Lady Lisle, who was deeply fond of the pup. The dog's curious name likely came from the French word pourquoi, meaning why, perhaps reflecting the fashionable French influence so admired at the Tudor court. In late 1533 or early 1534, Lady Lisle was advised by her agent John Hussey to present the dog as a New Year's gift to Sir Francis Bryan, Anne Boleyn's cousin and one of Henry VIII's closest companions. The Lisle family hoped to gain Bryan's favour and political support, which was a perfectly sensible strategy in Tudor England, where small gifts often carried enormous political significance. Hussey warned Lady Lisle that surrendering the little dog would upset her greatly, writing sympathetically that she, quote, must needs depart with your little Purkoy, despite how much it would grieve her. But Purkoy did not remain with Bryan for long. The tiny dog apparently charmed Queen Anne almost immediately. In January 1534, Bryan wrote to Lord Lisle thanking his wife for the gift, but explaining that the Queen had taken such a liking to Purkoy that the dog, quote, remained not above an hour in my hands, but that her grace took it from me. Anne became extremely attached to the little animal. But sadly, the story ended tragically only months later when Purkoy died after a fall. News of the accident terrified Anne's attendants so much that none of them dared tell her directly. According to reports from the court, the Queen had loved the little dog so dearly that her ladies begged Henry VIII himself to break the news to her. The incident reveals a surprisingly intimate glimpse of Anne Boleyn's private emotional life. Modern portrayals often focus on politics, ambition, religion, and scandal, but Purkoy's story reminds us that Anne also formed ordinary human attachments and experienced personal grief just like anyone else. Even amid the danger and grandeur of the Tudor court, she was simply a woman devastated by the loss of a beloved pet. Anne's ownership of a small lapdog reflected broader Renaissance trends among aristocratic women. tiny dogs had become symbols of refinement, status, and courtly sophistication. Noble women carried them, pampered them, fed them scraps from royal tables, and occasionally dressed them in decorative collars that cost more than many peasants earned in months. This was not entirely practical behaviour. Most Tudor dogs still worked for a living. England relied heavily on hunting dogs, mastiffs, sheepdogs, guard dogs, and terriers. Henry VIII himself was a passionate hunter who spent enormous amounts of time pursuing deer, boars, and game birds. Hunting was not merely entertainment, it was political theatre. A king who hunted appeared strong, vigorous, masculine, and divinely suited to rule. This mattered enormously to Henry because his psychology was built almost entirely around proving himself impressive. Tudor nobles categorized dogs very carefully. Greyhounds were associated with nobility and speed. Spaniels became increasingly popular as companion animals and hunting assistants. Mastiffs guarded homes and estates. Tiny lapdogs served companionship roles among elite women. The distinction between working animal and pet existed, but the categories frequently overlapped. People in Tudor England also believed animals reflected moral qualities. Loyalty became associated strongly with dogs. Cats occupied a bit more. Uncertain position, let's say. Cats were extremely useful. Tudor cities and villages depended on them for rodent control. Grain stores attracted rats constantly, and rats carried disease. A good cat was valuable. But cats also accumulated centuries of superstition. In medieval Europe, especially during the late Middle Ages, cats sometimes became associated with witchcraft, female independence, nighttime activity, and demonic imagery. Black cats in particular acquired sinister reputations in parts of Europe, though historians today believe the medieval fear of cats is often exaggerated in popular imagination. Many people simply kept cats because they worked. Monasteries had cats, taverns had cats, ships had cats, royal households had cats. Probably half of Europe had a cat sitting near a fire while pretending not to care about humanity. Dogs, meanwhile, enjoyed much stronger symbolic prestige. By the 16th century, pet keeping among European elites was becoming increasingly emotional and personal. Renaissance humanism encouraged greater interest in individual identity, personality, and private domestic life. Portraits began including pets not merely as decorative objects, but as reflections of companionship and affection. Anne Boleyn belonged fully to this Renaissance world. She was born sometime around 1501, though historians still debate the exact year. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious diplomat and courtier. The Boleyn family rose through royal favour during the reign of Henry VII and then Henry VIII. Anne received an unusually sophisticated education for an English noblewoman of the time. As a child, she spent time in the Netherlands under the patronage of Margaret of Austria, one of the most formidable political women in Europe. Margaret governed the Habsburg Netherlands with remarkable intelligence and maintained an advanced Renaissance court filled with scholars, musicians, diplomats, and humanist thinkers. Anne then travelled to France, where she served in the household of Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. France transformed Anne. The French court was stylish, intellectually fashionable, and politically dangerous. Anne learned French fluently. She absorbed continental fashion, music, dance, and sophisticated court etiquette. She developed sharp conversational skills and a reputation for wit. Importantly, she also encountered early reformist religious ideas that later influenced England's break from the Catholic Church. When Anne returned to England in the 1520s, she entered a Tudor court already full of intrigue. Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon since 1509. Catherine was intelligent, educated, and widely respected. Unfortunately for Henry, she had failed to produce a surviving male heir, and that became Henry's obsession. The Tudor dynasty itself was fragile. Henry's father had seized the throne only after decades of dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry VIII feared civil war would return if he died without a legitimate son. And then Anne Boleyn appeared. Unlike many royal mistresses, Anne refused to become Henry's casual lover. Whether from genuine principle, political calculation, or both, she resisted the king's advances unless marriage became possible. Henry reacted to this obstacle with the calm restraint for which he was famously not known. Over several years, he pursued annulment from Catherine of Aragon, arguing that their marriage violated biblical law because Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother Arthur. The Pope refused. This refusal launched one of the most consequential political and religious upheavals in English history. Henry eventually rejected papal authority altogether. Through a series of parliamentary acts during the 1530s, England separated from Rome and established the king as supreme head of the Church of England. This was not merely a divorce. It reshaped English politics, religion, economics, and culture permanently. Monasteries would later be dissolved, Catholic shrines destroyed, religious opponents executed, theological arguments spread through universities and churches. England entered generations of religious conflict, all because Henry VIII wanted a new wife. Historians sometimes describe this period with very dignified language such as constitutional transformation. But at its emotional core, much of the crisis resembled an extraordinarily destructive royal midlife crisis. Anne married Henry secretly in late 1532 or early 1533. Soon afterward, she became queen. Her coronation in June 1533 was magnificent. London staged elaborate pageants. Rich fabrics and gold decorations filled the streets. Foreign ambassadors observed carefully because European diplomacy increasingly revolved around England's religious crisis. Anne was intelligent enough to understand both her influence and her danger. She patronized reformist scholars. She promoted French fashions. She maintained an active political network at court. She also made enemies rapidly. Traditional Catholics despised her role in Catherine of Aragon's downfall. Conservative nobles distrusted her family's rise. Many common people viewed Catherine as the rightful queen. Then came the central disaster. Anne gave birth in September 1533. The child was not a son. It was Elizabeth. History would later remember Elizabeth I as one of England's greatest monarchs. At the time, Henry mostly reacted with disappointment. Anne later suffered miscarriages, including at least one probable male fetus. These losses damaged her political security terribly. Tudor queens existed largely to produce heirs. Failure in this area could become fatal. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at court grew increasingly tense. Henry's affection began fading. He turned his attention toward Jane Seymour. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's powerful minister, clashed politically with Anne over religious and financial matters. By 1536, Anne's position had collapsed. What followed remains one of the most controversial episodes in Tudor history. Anne was arrested in May 1536 and accused of adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, and conspiracy against the king. Most modern historians consider the charges almost certainly fabricated. Several accused men were tortured or pressured into confessions. Evidence was weak and contradictory. The accusations themselves often bordered on absurd. But Tudor justice operated according to royal necessity more than fairness. Anne was tried and condemned. On May 19th, 1536, she was executed at the Tower of London by a French swordsman specially brought for the task. She was probably around 35 years old. Henry married Jane Seymour less than 2 weeks later. The speed of this transition remains astonishing even by Tudor standards, which were generally not known for emotional subtlety. Amid all this political chaos, small details survive that reveal Anne as a real person rather than merely a historical symbol. Purkoy is one of those details. The dog appears in artistic depictions associated with Anne and her daughter Elizabeth. Tiny companion dogs often accompanied noblewomen constantly. They sat on laps during conversations, wandered palace chambers, and slept near beds. Royal palaces themselves were crowded and surprisingly chaotic places. Contrary to popular imagination, Tudor palaces did not resemble quiet museums. They were bustling administrative centres full of servants, guards, clerks, musicians, diplomats, cooks, petitioners, priests, fools, messengers, laundresses, and animals. Dogs moved freely through many parts of elite households. Not everyone approved. Some religious writers complained that noble women treated lapdogs better than the poor. Humanist critics mocked aristocratic excess and vanity. Physicians occasionally warned that indoor dogs spread fleas and disease. These concerns were entirely reasonable. Tudor hygiene standards were catastrophic by modern expectations. People bathed irregularly. Chamber pots emptied into streets. Animal waste accumulated constantly. Epidemics spread rapidly. And yet people still kissed their dogs. Human affection toward animals consistently survives circumstances that should logically discourage it. The Tudor period also witnessed changing ideas about emotion and domestic life. Medieval aristocratic culture emphasized lineage, warfare, and feudal hierarchy. Renaissance influence encouraged greater attention to private identity, family affection, and personal expression. Pets fit naturally into this cultural transition. Portraits from the 16th century increasingly included small dogs as symbols of loyalty, refinement, marriage, and companionship. Women especially became associated with lapdogs in elite visual culture. Sometimes the symbolism was affectionate. Sometimes it was mocking. Male writers occasionally portrayed fashionable women and their tiny dogs with deep irritation, usually because history's supply of men annoyed by women enjoying themselves has always remained plentiful. Dogs also occupied important roles in literature and folklore. English hunting manuals described breeding practices in detail. Bestiaries connected animals to moral lessons. Folk beliefs assigned supernatural meaning to animal behaviour. Howling dogs could signal death. Black dogs sometimes appeared in ghost stories. Certain hunting hounds acquired legendary reputations. The line between practical observation and superstition remained very thin. Medicine worked similarly. Tudor veterinary practices mixed experience, folklore, astrology, herbal remedies, and outright guesswork. Treatments for sick animals could involve herbs, bloodletting, prayer, ointments, and alarming quantities of substances nobody today would willingly apply to anything alive. Still, many owners clearly cared deeply for their animals. This emotional attachment crossed social classes. Peasants relied on working animals for survival. Farmers depended on horses, oxen, dogs, chickens, and cats daily. A lost animal could ruin a household economically. Nobles formed emotional bonds with prized hunting dogs and horses. Royal records from across Europe contain references to grieving owners, beloved pets, and expensive care for valued animals. The Tudor world was harsh, but it was not emotionally cold. Anne Boleyn herself became one of England's most enduring historical figures, partly because later generations transformed her into myth. Catholics portrayed her as a destructive seductress. Protestants sometimes remembered her as a martyr. Romantic writers emphasized her tragedy. Modern historians increasingly examine her intelligence and political agency. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would later rehabilitate aspects of Anne's memory indirectly, simply by becoming enormously successful. It is one of history's great ironies that Henry VIII's obsession with obtaining a son ultimately produced the daughter who secured the Tudor dynasty's greatest legacy. Elizabeth inherited many traits associated with Anne: intelligence, political caution, charisma, and formidable emotional discipline. And Elizabeth, too, loved dogs. Throughout the Tudor and Renaissance periods, pet culture continued expanding among European elites. Selective breeding increased. Companion animals became more visible in portraiture and domestic life. By the 17th and 18th centuries, many aristocratic households treated pets as established family companions. In this sense, Purkoy belonged to the beginning of a recognizable modern relationship between humans and pets. Not entirely modern, of course. Nobody in Tudor England was buying artisanal organic dog treats shaped like tiny vegetables. But emotional companionship between humans and animals was becoming increasingly visible and culturally accepted. Today, Anne Boleyn's political legacy remains enormous. Her relationship with Henry VIII helped trigger the English Reformation. The monarchy's authority changed permanently. England's religious identity transformed. Parliament gained increasing importance. The future Elizabethan age became possible. And somewhere within this gigantic historical upheaval was a tiny dog named Purkoy, wandering through palace chambers while bishops argued, ministers plotted, and one of England's most volatile kings dismantled centuries of religious tradition because he wanted a different wife. History often survives through these strange little details. A crown, a letter, a ring, a painting, a dog sleeping beside a queen who did not yet know she would lose her head. Perhaps that is partly why stories about historical pets endure. They remind us that even the most mythologized figures in history still pause to scratch a dog behind the ears, laugh at some ridiculous animal behavior, or feel comfort from a familiar companion during frightening times. Anne Boleyn lived in one of the most dangerous courts in Europe. Her rise transformed a kingdom. Her fall shocked contemporaries across the continent. Her daughter changed English history forever. And through at least part of that extraordinary story, there trotted little Purkoy. More than 3,000 years before social media transformed cats into rulers of the internet, the people of ancient Egypt had already reached a similar conclusion. Cats, in their opinion, were magnificent. Ancient Egypt's admiration for cats developed gradually over thousands of years, but by the New Kingdom period, around the 14th century BCE, felines occupied a position somewhere between useful household companion and sacred divine creature. They protected grain stores from rodents, killed snakes, guarded homes, and eventually became deeply connected with religion, mythology, royal symbolism, and the gods themselves. Among the many cats of ancient Egypt, one survives in history with an unusually personal story. Her name was Ta-Miu. Ta-Miu belonged to Prince Thutmose, the eldest son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III during the 18th dynasty. And unlike countless ancient animals who vanished from history entirely, Ta-Miu received something extraordinary after death: her own decorated limestone sarcophagus. That fact alone tells us a great deal about both ancient Egypt and the emotional relationship Egyptians formed with animals, because Egyptians did not casually bury cats in elaborate coffins. This was an honor. To understand Ta-Miu's world, it helps first to understand Egypt itself during the New Kingdom, one of the wealthiest and most powerful periods in Egyptian history. The New Kingdom lasted roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE and represented the height of Egypt's imperial power. During these centuries, Egypt expanded militarily into Nubia and the Near East, accumulated enormous wealth through trade and conquest, constructed monumental temples, and developed a court culture of astonishing luxury. This was the Egypt of golden masks, vast temple complexes, colossal statues, diplomatic marriages, and richly painted tombs. It was also an intensely organized society. The Nile River shaped nearly everything. Each year the river flooded predictably, depositing fertile black silt along its banks. Agriculture depended on this cycle completely. Egyptian calendars, taxation systems, religious ceremonies, and political stability all revolved around the Nile. When the flooding worked properly, Egypt prospered. When it failed, famine followed. The Egyptians therefore viewed cosmic order itself as fragile. This concept, known as Ma'at, represented harmony, balance, justice, and divine order. The pharaoh's job was not simply to rule politically, but to maintain cosmic stability. Ancient Egyptian religion was immensely complicated and evolved continuously over thousands of years. Gods merged, changed forms, absorbed regional traditions, and developed overlapping identities. Animals occupied a central place in this religious imagination. Falcons represented Horus. Jackals became associated with Anubis. Crocodiles connected with Sobek. Ibises represented Thoth. Cats became linked especially with Bastet. Bastet began centuries earlier as a lioness goddess associated with warfare and royal protection, but over time she evolved into a more domestic feline deity connected with motherhood, fertility, music, protection, and the home. By the New Kingdom, Bastet's cult had become enormously popular. Egyptians did not necessarily believe that ordinary cats literally were gods. The situation was more nuanced than that. Animals could embody divine qualities or serve as manifestations of divine power. Sacred animals at temples sometimes received worship because they represented a god's earthly presence. At the same time, ordinary household cats remained practical creatures. They hunted, they stole food, they ignored commands with impressive confidence, and they occasionally sat in places specifically chosen to inconvenience humans. Some aspects of cat behavior, apparently, transcend civilization. The domestication of cats likely began in the Near East thousands of years before the New Kingdom. As agriculture spread, grain stores attracted rodents, which attracted wildcats. Humans noticed the arrangement was useful. Cats noticed there were now buildings full of mice. A mutually beneficial relationship quietly emerged. Egyptians became especially associated with cats because artistic and archaeological evidence survives in enormous quantities. Cats appear constantly in Egyptian art. They sit beneath chairs, hunt birds in marsh scenes, wear jewellery, accompany noblewomen, lounge beside banquet guests, appear in tomb paintings. Some images are surprisingly affectionate and realistic. Egyptian artists observed animal behaviour carefully. Cats arch, stretch, leap, groom themselves, and stalk prey with recognisable accuracy. One painting from the tomb of Nebamun shows a cat hunting birds amid papyrus reeds, while somehow maintaining an expression of total self-confidence. Modern cat owners will recognise this immediately. The Egyptian elite especially prized exotic and beautiful animals. Pharaohs maintained royal menageries containing foreign creatures obtained through trade and military campaigns. Monkeys, cheetahs, exotic birds, and other unusual animals appeared at court. Yet cats occupied a more intimate role. Unlike lions or crocodiles, cats lived directly among humans. They slept in homes, shared domestic spaces, protected food supplies, accompanied families. This closeness likely contributed to their growing emotional importance. Which brings us to Prince Thutmose. Thutmose lived during the reign of his father, Amenhotep III, one of ancient Egypt's wealthiest and most successful pharaohs. Amenhotep III ruled approximately from 1390 to 1353 BCE and presided over a period of extraordinary prosperity. International diplomacy flourished. Massive construction projects transformed Egypt. Gold flowed into royal treasuries. Foreign rulers exchanged gifts and letters with the Egyptian court. The royal family lived amid staggering luxury. Amenhotep III built enormous palaces decorated with painted walls, pools, gardens, and elaborate ceremonial spaces. The royal court employed thousands of officials, servants, priests, artisans, and labourers. Prince Thutmose was expected to inherit this world. As eldest son, he stood directly in line for the throne. He also served as a high-ranking priest, particularly connected with the cult of Ptah in Memphis. This dual political and religious role reflected elite Egyptian expectations. Royal sons often held priestly offices that reinforced both political authority and divine legitimacy. Then, something happened. Thutmose died young. Historians do not know exactly how. Disease remains the most likely explanation. Ancient Egypt faced constant medical dangers despite its sophistication. Infections, parasites, accidents, malnutrition during poor harvests, and epidemic illnesses threatened every social class. Egyptian medicine was advanced in some ways and deeply strange in others. Doctors performed surgical procedures, treated wounds, used herbal remedies, and documented symptoms carefully. Medical papyri reveal significant practical knowledge. At the same time, treatments could involve magical incantations, animal substances, honey, minerals, oils, and occasionally ingredients that modern medicine would classify under the technical category of absolutely not. The death of Prince Thutmose dramatically altered Egyptian history. Because after his death, another son became heir. That son was Amenhotep IV. Today we know him better as Akhenaten. Akhenaten would become one of the most controversial and unusual rulers in ancient Egyptian history. He attempted a radical religious transformation centered around worship of the Aten, the solar disk. Traditional gods lost royal support. Artistic styles changed dramatically. A new capital city arose at Amarna. And Akhenaten, notably, was the father of Tutankhamun. So the death of Prince Thutmose indirectly shaped one of the most famous periods in Egyptian history. Yet amid this enormous dynastic shift survives the quiet story of his cat. Ta-Miu's sarcophagus was discovered at Saqqara, the vast necropolis near Memphis. The coffin bears inscriptions identifying the cat as the Osirified cat, Ta-Miu. This phrase is important. To become Osirified meant association with Osiris, god of the dead, and the afterlife. Egyptians believed the dead could undergo transformation and rebirth through divine processes linked with Osiris. Granting this language to a cat demonstrates genuine ritual significance. Ta-Miu was not discarded casually. She was memorialized. Her limestone sarcophagus was carefully carved and decorated. This reflects broader Egyptian practices surrounding animal burials. Millions of animal mummies existed in ancient Egypt. Some served as religious offerings. Worshippers purchased mummified animals connected with particular gods and dedicated them at temples. Cats, ibises, crocodiles, falcons, fish, dogs, and even scarab beetles underwent mummification. The scale was extraordinary. Modern archaeologists have discovered cat cemeteries containing enormous numbers of feline remains. In the 19th century, European excavators removed vast quantities of mummified cats from Egypt with a level of cultural sensitivity best described as catastrophically non-existent. One shipment of ancient cat mummies reportedly ended up processed into fertilizer. Archaeology in the Victorian era occasionally resembled a competition to determine how quickly Europeans could make terrible decisions overseas. Still, these discoveries revealed the immense importance of cats within Egyptian society. Not every cat received elite burial treatment like Ta-Miu. Most did not. But household affection toward cats appears widespread. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus later wrote that Egyptian families mourned dead cats intensely. According to his account, household members shaved their eyebrows as a sign of grief when a cat died. Historians debate how universally this practice occurred, but the underlying emotional attachment seems genuine. Herodotus also claimed that during house fires, Egyptians worried more about rescuing cats than extinguishing flames. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories demonstrate Egypt's international reputation for feline devotion. Cats also possessed legal and economic value. Exporting cats from Egypt may have been restricted at times because they were considered useful and culturally significant. Egyptian ships likely helped spread domesticated cats throughout the Mediterranean world. The relationship between humans and cats gradually expanded into Europe, Asia, and beyond. So in a strange sense, many modern house cats owe part of their global success to ancient Egyptian enthusiasm, which, if cats understood history, they would probably consider entirely expected. Life in New Kingdom Egypt varied enormously depending on social class. Elite Egyptians enjoyed large homes, servants, fine linen clothing, cosmetics, jewellery, music, elaborate meals, and gardens. Common labourers lived far more modestly. Most Egyptians worked in agriculture. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, vegetables, and flax. Others worked as artisans, scribes, builders, merchants, fishermen, or soldiers. Animals shaped everyday life everywhere. Oxen pulled ploughs. Donkeys carried goods. Geese and ducks supplied food. Dogs guarded homes and assisted hunting. Monkeys occasionally appeared as exotic pets. Cats controlled vermin. Religion saturated daily existence. Temples dominated major cities economically and spiritually. Priests conducted rituals constantly to maintain divine favour. Festivals involved music, processions, feasting, and public ceremonies. The afterlife occupied enormous importance. Egyptians prepared for death continuously through tomb construction, funerary texts, offerings, and rituals. Elite tombs contained paintings depicting idealized daily life meant to continue eternally after death. Animals appeared in these tombs because Egyptians wanted familiar comforts in eternity. Dogs accompanied hunters. Cats lounged beneath chairs. Birds filled marsh scenes. The boundary between earthly and spiritual life remained fluid. Ta-Miu's burial therefore fits naturally into broader Egyptian beliefs. If humans deserved care in the afterlife, beloved animals could receive it too. The royal family itself maintained especially close relationships with symbolism involving animals. Pharaohs associated themselves with lions, bulls, falcons, and other powerful creatures. Royal hunting scenes emphasized strength and divine authority. Amenhotep III famously hunted lions in enormous numbers, or at least claimed to. Royal inscriptions occasionally functioned partly as propaganda. Ancient kings were not entirely above exaggeration. Still, royal animal symbolism mattered deeply. The king represented order, conquering chaos, power, defeating danger, civilization, mastering nature. Yet the small domestic cat represented something gentler, protection within the home, comfort, companionship, grace. That emotional intimacy helps explain why Ta-Miu's story continues attracting attention today. We possess very little personal information about most ancient individuals, even royal ones. But a cat's decorated coffin suddenly creates a vivid, emotional connection across more than 3 millennia. A prince loved this animal enough to ensure she received careful burial. That feeling is recognizable instantly. Historians often focus on wars, dynasties, economics, and monuments because those subjects leave large amounts of evidence. But history is also full of quieter relationships. A child feeding a pet. A family mourning an animal. Someone talking to a cat despite understanding perfectly well that the cat has no intention of contributing meaningfully to the conversation. Ancient Egypt can sometimes feel distant because its monuments are so colossal. The pyramids, the temples, the giant statues. Yet stories like Ta-Miu's remind us that ancient Egyptians also worried about ordinary things. Illness, family, politics, food, pets. And naturally, like every civilization in history, they also had bureaucracy. Thousands upon thousands of documents survive recording taxes, grain shipments, labour schedules, legal disputes, and temple administration. Some poor Egyptian official almost certainly spent his career counting grain while sacred cats wandered through temple courtyards, receiving more admiration than he ever did. Yup, history can be cruel that way. The legacy of ancient Egyptian cat culture became enormous. Greek and Roman writers commented on it repeatedly. Egyptian artistic styles influenced later depictions of cats. Modern fascination with Egypt often includes feline imagery automatically. Today, Bastet remains one of the most recognizable Egyptian deities in popular culture. Museums across the world display cat statues, cat mummies, and cat-related artifacts from Egypt. And Ta-Miu herself still survives in memory because of one carefully prepared coffin from over 3,000 years ago. Prince Thutmose never became pharaoh. His younger brother reshaped Egyptian religion. Dynasties rose and fell. Empires vanished. Temples crumbled into desert sand. But the memory of a beloved cat endured. Perhaps that is fitting. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for more than 3,000 years, surviving invasions, dynastic struggles, environmental pressures, and political transformations. And throughout those centuries, cats remained patiently nearby, hunting mice, receiving worship, stealing food, appearing in art, and convincing humans they were simultaneously useful workers and sacred beings. An arrangement cats still seem perfectly comfortable maintaining even today. In the ancient world, before engines, railways, or airplanes, power moved at the speed of an animal. Empires expanded because horses carried armies. Messages survived because horses outran enemies. Kings conquered continents because cavalry arrived before resistance could organize. And among all the famous horses of history, none became more legendary than Bucephalus, the great black war horse of Alexander the Great. According to ancient tradition, Bucephalus was massive, fierce, nearly unmanageable, and intelligent enough to recognize battle. He carried Alexander through some of the most astonishing military campaigns ever recorded, travelling from Greece through Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, and into India. By the end of Alexander's life, the horse had become more than an animal. Bucephalus became part of the myth. The story begins in Macedon during the 4th century BCE, a period when the Greek world was fragmented, competitive, and deeply suspicious of Macedonians. Classical Greece consisted of independent city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. These cities shared language, religion, and cultural traditions, but spent remarkable amounts of time fighting one another. The Greeks invented philosophy, democracy, advanced mathematics, tragic theatre, and several hundred distinct methods of political argument. They also remained intensely committed to mutual hostility. North of the Greek city-states lay Macedon, a kingdom often dismissed by southern Greeks as semi-barbaric. This was unfair. Macedon possessed sophisticated political structures, aristocratic traditions, military strength, and strong cultural connections to the Greek world. But Macedonians emphasized kingship and cavalry warfare more heavily than many southern city-states. Horses occupied a central role in Macedonian aristocratic life. A nobleman's horse reflected status, military usefulness, wealth, and masculinity. Riding skill mattered enormously. Cavalry units formed elite components of Macedonian armies. And no Macedonian valued horses more than King Philip II. Philip II, father of Alexander, transformed Macedon into the dominant military power in Greece. Through military reforms, diplomacy, marriages, and conquest, he created an efficient professional army centered around the famous Macedonian phalanx and powerful cavalry forces. Philip was brilliant. He was also ruthless, manipulative, and extraordinarily ambitious. Ancient kingship generally encouraged these traits. Philip's court revolved around warfare, hunting, aristocratic competition, and political intrigue. Noble boys received harsh military education from an early age. Alexander was born into this environment in 356 BCE. His mother, Olympias, belonged to the royal family of Epirus and cultivated an image of intense religious devotion and mystery. Ancient sources describe her participating in ecstatic rituals associated with Dionysus and keeping snakes. Historians debate how much of this is exaggerated propaganda. Ancient historians often reacted to powerful women by immediately inventing stories that made them sound vaguely supernatural. Still, Olympias clearly influenced Alexander profoundly. Alexander also received one of history's most famous educations. His tutor was Aristotle, the philosopher whose writings shaped logic, ethics, biology, politics, physics, rhetoric, and several other academic fields simultaneously, because ancient Greek intellectuals apparently considered specialization a sign of laziness. Under Aristotle, Alexander studied literature, science, philosophy, medicine, and Homeric epic poetry. The Iliad especially affected him. Alexander admired Achilles intensely and modelled aspects of his identity around heroic ideals from Homeric tradition. Glory, military excellence, and eternal fame became central ambitions. And somewhere during Alexander's youth came the story of Bucephalus. The tale survives mainly through later ancient writers like Plutarch. According to the story, a Thessalian horse dealer brought a magnificent but uncontrollable horse before King Philip. The animal was enormous, violent, and impossible to ride. Philip's men failed repeatedly to manage it. Philip prepared to reject the horse as worthless. Then the young Alexander intervened. Alexander noticed something the adults had missed. The horse appeared frightened of its own shadow. Turning Bucephalus toward the sun so the shadow fell behind him, Alexander calmed the animal, mounted successfully, and rode away to the astonishment of the court. Philip supposedly wept with pride and declared, quote, "Seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Ancient historians loved scenes like this. Whether entirely true or partly embellished, the story reveals several important things. First, horse training mattered deeply in ancient aristocratic culture. Second, intelligence and self-control were considered signs of legitimate leadership. And third, ancient biographers absolutely adored dramatic foreshadowing. Bucephalus himself likely came from Thessaly, a region famous for horse breeding. The horse's name probably meant ox-head or bull-headed, perhaps referring to the shape of his head or a marking on his face. Ancient descriptions vary. Some later legends claimed Bucephalus possessed unusual markings or even peacock-like colouring, though these stories likely grew through centuries of exaggeration. Historical truth tends to acquire decorative accessories over time. Still, Bucephalus clearly became Alexander's favoured mount. This mattered enormously. War horses in antiquity required exceptional training. Ancient battlefields were terrifying environments filled with noise, blood, projectiles, screaming men, metal weapons, and chaos. Most horses understandably preferred not to participate. A cavalry horse had to remain disciplined amid violence while responding instantly to its rider. Ancient cavalry did not function like modern mounted units. Riders fought with spears, swords, and javelins at close range. Horses crashed physically into enemy formations. Speed, coordination, and trust between horse and rider became matters of survival. Alexander's cavalry arm, known as the companion cavalry, formed one of the most effective military forces of the ancient world. These aristocratic horsemen served as elite shock troops. Alexander often personally led cavalry charges, which was either extraordinarily brave or alarmingly reckless depending on one's perspective. Probably both. In 336 BCE, Philip II was assassinated. The exact circumstances remain debated. Ancient politics rarely lacked conspiracy theories. Alexander became king at age 20. Immediately he faced rebellions, political instability, and hostile Greek city-states, hoping Macedonian dominance would collapse. Alexander responded with terrifying efficiency. He secured Macedonia, crushed revolts, and destroyed Thebes in 335 BCE as a warning to potential rebels. The destruction shocked Greece. Ancient historians often admired Alexander greatly, but he could display extraordinary brutality when politically useful. Then came Persia. For generations, the Persian Empire had dominated the eastern Mediterranean world. Vast, wealthy, and administratively sophisticated, the Achaemenid Persian Empire stretched from Egypt to Central Asia. Alexander invaded in 334 BCE. Few people expected what followed. Over the next decade, Alexander defeated Persian armies repeatedly at battles including Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela. He captured Egypt, seized Babylon, occupied Persepolis, pursued Persian King Darius III across Asia. The scale of conquest was astonishing. And throughout these campaigns, Bucephalus remained beside him. Ancient warfare depended heavily on animals beyond horses alone. Armies required pack animals, mules, oxen, camels, hunting dogs, and supply caravans. Logistics determined military success. An army depended not only on food, weapons, and discipline, but also on the exhausted animals hauling supplies across mountains, deserts, and battlefields. Horses held special prestige because they symbolized aristocratic status and military dominance. The Hellenistic world inherited many horse traditions from earlier cultures, including Persians, Scythians, and Near Eastern kingdoms. Persian cavalry especially impressed Greek observers. Alexander himself adopted aspects of Persian royal culture after conquering the empire, including clothing styles, court rituals, and administrative practices. This angered many Macedonians. His men wanted conquest. They were less enthusiastic about cultural integration. Alexander increasingly viewed himself not simply as king of Macedon, but ruler of a universal empire. This transformation affected his image profoundly. In Egypt, he visited the oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa Oasis. Ancient sources suggest the priests may have acknowledged divine parentage or favour. Afterward, Alexander increasingly embraced semi-divine symbolism. Whether he genuinely believed himself divine remains debated. At minimum, he clearly enjoyed people treating him that way. Animals also occupied important places in Greek mythology and religion. Horses especially carried deep symbolic meaning. Poseidon, god of the sea, was associated with horses. Heroes rode divine steeds. Centaurs embodied the tension between civilization and wildness. Chariot races formed major components of athletic festivals. Greek literature frequently portrayed horses as reflections of noble character. A disciplined horse symbolized self-control. An untamed one represented dangerous passion. Philosophers even used horses metaphorically. Plato compared the human soul to a chariot pulled by competing horses representing different impulses. Ancient intellectuals loved explaining human existence through elaborate horse metaphors. Meanwhile, actual horses mostly wanted food and fewer spears nearby. Alexander's campaigns carried Macedonian armies farther east than any Greek force had travelled before. The soldiers encountered unfamiliar animals, climates, landscapes, and cultures. Elephants, especially, terrified Macedonian troops initially. Persian and Indian armies used war elephants as psychological and physical weapons. These creatures towered over horses and men alike. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, Alexander faced King Porus of India and his elephant corps. The battle was difficult and bloody. And according to tradition, it was around this campaign that Bucephalus died. Ancient accounts differ slightly. Some claim the horse died from wounds sustained during battle. Others suggest old age and exhaustion contributed. Bucephalus was likely around 30 years old by this point, extremely elderly for a war horse enduring years of campaigning. Alexander reportedly mourned deeply. He founded a city named Bucephala in the horse's honour near the Hydaspes River. This was not entirely unusual for Alexander. He founded cities constantly. Alexander naming settlements after himself became one of the ancient world's most aggressive branding campaigns. Still, dedicating one to Bucephalus reflected genuine attachment. The relationship between warriors and horses in antiquity could become intensely personal. A cavalry rider depended completely on the animal beneath him. In battle, panic or injury to a horse could mean death. Trust mattered. Familiarity mattered. Survival depended on partnership. Alexander's grief therefore makes emotional sense. And Bucephalus had accompanied him through nearly his entire adult life. Alexander himself died only 3 years later in Babylon in 323 BCE at age 32. His empire fragmented almost immediately. The generals who succeeded him, known as the Diadochi, fought decades of wars dividing the conquered territories into competing Hellenistic kingdoms. Yet Alexander's cultural legacy endured enormously. Greek language spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Hellenistic cities flourished. Science, philosophy, and art expanded. Cultural exchange intensified between Greece, Egypt, Persia, and Asia. And Bucephalus survived within the legend. Ancient writers repeatedly returned to the story because it symbolized ideal kingship. The young prince understands what others fail to see. He masters the untamable beast. Horse and rider conquer the world together. It possesses all the structure of myth. But unlike many legends, Bucephalus almost certainly existed as a real animal at the centre of genuine historical events. That combination makes the story enduringly powerful. The ancient world viewed animals differently from modern societies in many ways. Animals served practical purposes first. Horses fought wars, dogs hunted, oxen ploughed, donkeys transported goods, sheep provided wool. Yet, emotional bonds still formed constantly. Ancient epitaphs occasionally mourn beloved animals. Greek and Roman literature includes references to cherished dogs, horses, and birds. The boundary between utility and affection was never entirely separate. Bucephalus perhaps represents the clearest ancient example of this dual relationship. He was both military asset and companion, weapon and friend, status symbol and living creature. And through centuries of retelling, the horse eventually became inseparable from Alexander himself. Today, Bucephalus remains one of the most famous animals in world history. Painters depict the dramatic taming scene repeatedly. Novelists romanticize the partnership. Historians debate which parts of the legend are accurate. But even stripped of exaggeration, the core story remains compelling. A young conqueror and his horse crossed much of the known world together. They rode through deserts, mountain passes, battlefields, royal capitals, and foreign empires. And somewhere amid the collapse of kingdoms and creation of new worlds, one exhausted old warhorse finally reached the end of the journey. Not a bad achievement for a creature once dismissed as impossible to handle, right? In the year 802 CE, somewhere along the roads of medieval Europe, an elephant was travelling toward the court of Charlemagne. This was not a sentence people in Western Europe heard very often. The animal's name was Abul-Abbas, and he was a diplomatic gift sent by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid to the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne. The elephant crossed enormous distances, survived difficult travel conditions, astonished nearly everyone who saw him, and eventually became one of the most famous animals of the early Middle Ages. Abul-Abbas also represented something larger than himself. He symbolized a rare connection between two enormous powers of the early medieval world: the Carolingian Empire in Western Europe and the Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad. To modern audiences, the medieval period is often imagined as isolated, dirty, chaotic, and intellectually asleep. This is partly because generations of later writers enjoyed describing the Middle Ages as several centuries during which humanity collectively misplaced civilization. The reality was considerably more complicated. The world of Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid was connected through trade routes, diplomacy, religion, warfare, scholarship, and political ambition stretching across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And somewhere, within this vast international network, walked one bewildered elephant. To understand why Abul-Abbas mattered so much, it helps to understand the strange and transitional world into which he arrived. Western Europe, during the 8th and 9th centuries, was emerging from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Rome had fallen centuries earlier, though historians still debate exactly what fall means in this context. Cities survived. Trade survived, religion survived, but political unity fragmented. Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman imperial administration across much of Western Europe. Among these kingdoms, the Franks gradually became dominant. The Carolingian dynasty rose to power during the 8th century under Charles Martel, famous for defeating an invading Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in 732. His grandson was Charlemagne. Charlemagne, or Carolus Magnus in Latin, meaning Charles the Great, was born probably around 742 CE. He inherited a Frankish kingdom and transformed it into an empire. Through decades of military campaigns, diplomacy, religious expansion, and administrative reform, Charlemagne conquered enormous territories, including much of modern France, Germany, northern Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and surrounding regions. He fought Saxons, Lombards, Avars, Slavs, and various rebellious nobles. Quite frequently, Charlemagne appears in medieval sources as energetic, imposing, intelligent, and deeply committed to Christian kingship. He was also extremely tall by early medieval standards. Contemporary writer Einhard described him as over 6 feet tall, which in the early Middle Ages probably made him resemble a wandering cathedral. The Carolingian world remained heavily rural. Most people lived in small villages and worked in agriculture. Forests covered large portions of Europe. Roads were poor. Literacy remained limited outside religious institutions and elite circles. But this was not a primitive society. Monasteries preserved scholarship. Trade routes connected distant regions. Royal courts functioned as centres of law, politics, and administration. Craftsmen produced impressive metalwork, manuscripts, textiles, and architecture. Animals shaped daily existence everywhere. Horses provided transport and military mobility. Oxen ploughed fields. Dogs guarded property and assisted hunting. Falcons accompanied noble hunts. Pigs wandered through forests feeding on acorns. The medieval economy depended fundamentally on animals. A peasant family without livestock faced disaster. A noble without horses lost military effectiveness. A kingdom without agricultural animals starved. At the same time, medieval Europeans inherited symbolic ideas about animals from Christianity, classical traditions, folklore, and local superstition. Bestiaries, enormously popular medieval texts, described animals both real and imaginary, while assigning them moral lessons. Lions symbolized kingship. Foxes represented cunning. Dogs represented loyalty. Dragons represented evil. And elephants occupied a category somewhere between exotic marvel and theological puzzle. Most Europeans had never seen an elephant. Many only knew them through classical texts, travellers' stories, biblical references, or illustrations created by artists who had clearly never encountered the animal themselves. Some medieval elephant drawings resemble large pigs suffering existential confusion. Accurate zoology was not always the period's strongest discipline. Still, educated Europeans knew elephants existed. Ancient Roman writers like Pliny the Elder described them extensively. The memory of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants during the Punic Wars remained famous. But living elephants in Western Europe were extraordinarily rare, which made Abul-Abbas spectacular. Meanwhile, far to the east and south, the Abbasid Caliphate represented one of the world's greatest centres of wealth, scholarship, and political power. Founded in 750 CE after overthrowing the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasids established their capital at Baghdad. Baghdad became one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth. The city contained libraries, markets, palaces, mosques, workshops, gardens, and international trade connections extending from Spain to India and China. Science, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and literature flourished. The Abbasid world preserved and expanded knowledge inherited from Greek, Persian, Indian, and earlier Islamic traditions. At the centre of this empire stood Harun al-Rashid. Harun ruled from 786 to 809 CE, and later became legendary through stories associated with 1001 Nights, though those tales blend fiction and reality freely. Historically, Harun presided over a wealthy and culturally vibrant court. Diplomacy formed an important part of Abbasid power. Foreign rulers exchanged gifts constantly. Luxury objects, textiles, spices, books, weapons, precious metals, animals, and exotic curiosities travelled enormous distances. Diplomatic gift-giving was serious political theatre. A ruler demonstrated wealth and sophistication through generosity. And frankly, sending someone an elephant was difficult to ignore. Relations between Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid remain partly mysterious. The two rulers never met personally, but diplomatic contacts existed. Both powers shared tensions with the Byzantine Empire. Trade interests also mattered. Christian pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem benefited from relatively cooperative relations between the Carolingians and Abbasids. At some point during these exchanges, Harun sent Charlemagne several gifts. Among them was Abul-Abbas. According to the Royal Frankish Annals, the elephant arrived in 802 after being transported by a Jewish merchant and diplomat named Isaac. Isaac's journey alone was extraordinary. He travelled between the Carolingian and Abbasid worlds, acting as intermediary across vast cultural and geographic distances. Merchants, diplomats, and travellers like Isaac connected medieval civilizations far more than people often realise. The elephant's route likely involved travel by ship and land across the Mediterranean world. Transporting an elephant in the early Middle Ages was a logistical nightmare. Elephants require enormous amounts of food and water. They become stressed during transport. They are difficult to house, and they attract attention everywhere. One suspects many medieval villagers, seeing Abul-Abbas for the first time, experienced several minutes of complete disbelief. For Charlemagne's court, the elephant represented prestige beyond imagination. Royal courts throughout history have loved exotic animals. Pharaohs collected them. Roman emperors displayed them. Chinese emperors maintained menageries. Islamic rulers exchanged them diplomatically. European monarchs later filled royal zoos with creatures imported from across the globe. Exotic animals symbolized wealth, international connections, and imperial power. If a ruler possessed an elephant, that ruler clearly had access to resources and trade networks extending far beyond ordinary kingdoms. Charlemagne's court moved constantly rather than remaining fixed in one capital. The emperor travelled between royal palaces and estates across his empire. His household included nobles, clergy, warriors, servants, scribes, cooks, diplomats, and attendants. And now, apparently, an elephant. The administrative paperwork became slightly more complicated. Feeding Abul-Abbas alone must have required enormous effort. An elephant can consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation daily. Medieval Northern Europe was not exactly designed around elephant care. No established elephant management infrastructure existed in Aachen, there was probably no local specialist available. No medieval handbook titled Practical Elephant Maintenance for Frankish Administrators. People likely improvised constantly. Yet Abul-Abbas survived for years. This suggests substantial royal resources and effort went into maintaining him. The elephant likely accompanied Charlemagne on certain journeys and public appearances. For ordinary people, seeing Abul-Abbas may have resembled encountering a creature from mythology. The medieval imagination blurred boundaries between natural history, theology, legend, and rumour. Elephants already occupied symbolic importance in Christian thought. Some medieval writers believed elephants represented purity, wisdom, or moral strength. Others repeated bizarre claims inherited from classical sources. One persistent legend claimed elephants lacked knees and therefore could not lie down properly. According to this theory, if an elephant fell over, it required assistance standing again. This was obviously completely incorrect. But medieval natural history often prioritized symbolic storytelling over direct observation. To be fair, most medieval Europeans had limited opportunities to verify elephant biomechanics personally. The Carolingian period itself represented an important cultural transformation. Historians sometimes call this era the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne promoted education, manuscript copying, church reform, and scholarship. Monasteries and cathedral schools expanded learning. Latin literacy improved among elites. Classical texts survived partly through Carolingian copying efforts. Charlemagne himself probably read Latin to some degree, though he struggled with writing. According to Einhard, he attempted practicing writing beneath his pillow at night, which creates the unexpectedly charming image of one of Europe's greatest conquerors doing homework in bed. Religion dominated medieval life. Christianity shaped law, politics, morality, art, and intellectual culture. Monasteries served as spiritual and economic centres. Saints' relics attracted pilgrims. Church bells structured daily routines. At the same time, folk beliefs and older traditions survived. Medieval people believed strongly in omens, miracles, demons, supernatural interventions, and divine judgment. Animals often carried symbolic or spiritual meaning. Bird flight could suggest omens. Wolves represented danger and wilderness. Certain animals appeared in saints' legends. Monstrous creatures filled maps and stories. An elephant therefore arrived not merely as an animal, but as a creature loaded with symbolic significance. Abul-Abbas became evidence of Charlemagne's global importance. If rulers from distant Islamic empires sent him elephants, clearly he mattered enormously. And Charlemagne certainly agreed with this assessment. In 800 CE, shortly before Abul-Abbas arrived, Charlemagne had been crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome. This coronation revived the concept of a Western Roman emperor centuries after Rome's collapse. The political implications were enormous. Charlemagne now presented himself as protector of Christendom and heir to imperial tradition. The Byzantine Empire strongly disagreed with this interpretation. Byzantine emperors generally considered themselves the actual Roman emperors because, inconveniently for Charlemagne's propaganda, they literally were Roman emperors. Abul-Abbas eventually died around 810 CE. The Royal Frankish Annals report that the elephant died while accompanying Charlemagne's forces near the Rhine during a military campaign. The exact cause remains unknown. Climate, travel stress, disease, or age, all may have contributed. Northern Europe was not ideal elephant territory. It is likely that he never adapted to the Nordic climate, and that he died of pneumonia. Still, the fact that Abul-Abbas survived years in Carolingian Europe remains remarkable. His death was significant enough to record in official annals, demonstrating how unusual and important he remained. Most medieval animals vanished from history entirely. Abul-Abbas became memorable because he occupied the intersection of diplomacy, empire, religion, and wonder. He connected worlds. Modern audiences sometimes imagine medieval Europe as isolated from Islamic civilization except through warfare. But reality included trade, diplomacy, intellectual exchange, and complex political relationships. Arabic scientific and philosophical works later entered Europe partly through these broader networks. Luxury goods travelled constantly, ideas travelled, people travelled, and occasionally, elephants travelled. The story of Abul-Abbas also reveals something enduring about human fascination with extraordinary animals. Throughout history, rulers used exotic creatures to project authority and magnificence. But ordinary people also responded emotionally. A medieval peasant who glimpsed Abul-Abbas may have remembered the experience for life. Children probably stared in amazement. Monks probably wrote detailed descriptions. Nobles probably boasted about seeing the emperor's elephant. And somewhere in the middle of all this attention stood a very large animal who likely wanted food, water, and fewer Europeans pointing at him. Today, Abul-Abbas survives as one of the most curious diplomatic stories of the Middle Ages. He appears in histories of Charlemagne, studies of medieval diplomacy, discussions of animals in history, and accounts of cross-cultural exchange. More importantly, he reminds us that the medieval world was larger, stranger, and more interconnected than stereotypes suggest. The early 9th century was not a forgotten age stumbling blindly through darkness. It was a world of emperors and caliphs, monasteries and markets, scholars and merchants, warriors and diplomats, long-distance trade routes, crossing continents. And in the middle of it all walked Abul-Abbas, Charlemagne's elephant, lumbering patiently through history while bewildered medieval Europeans attempted to explain him. In the final decades of Imperial China, while foreign powers pressed against the borders of the Qing Empire and reformers argued desperately about the future of the nation, the most powerful woman in China devoted considerable attention to her tiny dogs. Their names included Hai Ling, Shadza, and numerous elegant Pekingese companions who wandered through the halls of the Forbidden City receiving treatment that many human beings could only envy. This was the world of Empress Dowager Cixi. To her admirers, Cixi was an intelligent political survivor who held together a collapsing empire through impossible crises. To her enemies, she became the embodiment of imperial excess, conservatism, manipulation, and dynastic decline. To historians, she remains one of the most complicated figures in 19th century history. And throughout the chaos of rebellions, invasions, modernization crises, assassinations, palace intrigue, and collapsing imperial authority, there were also small palace dogs sleeping on silk cushions. The contrast feels absurd, which is precisely why it is historically fascinating. Cixi lived during the Qing dynasty, the final imperial dynasty of China, founded by the Manchus in 1644. By the 19th century, Qing China governed one of the largest populations on Earth. The empire stretched across enormous territories including modern China, Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and beyond. For centuries, the Qing presided over relative prosperity, sophisticated administration, artistic achievement, and extensive international trade. But by the time Cixi entered the imperial court, the empire faced mounting pressure. European powers increasingly demanded trade access. Opium addiction destabilized society. Internal rebellions killed millions. Military defeats exposed technological weakness. Foreign governments forced humiliating concessions onto the Qing state. And inside the Forbidden City, politics remained as dangerous as ever. The Forbidden City itself was one of the largest palace complexes in the world. Constructed during the Ming dynasty and maintained by the Qing, it functioned as both ceremonial center and political fortress. Thousands of people lived and worked there. Emperors, concubines, eunuchs, servants, officials, guards, artisans, cooks, physicians, priests. And eventually, many very, very spoiled dogs. Cixi was born in 1835 into the Yehe-Nara clan, part of the Manchu aristocracy. Her birth name remains debated among historians because Qing court conventions often obscured women's personal names in official records. At around age 16, she entered the imperial court as a lower-ranking concubine of the Xianfeng emperor. The Qing imperial harem operated according to strict hierarchy and ritual. Hundreds of women could belong to the emperor's household. Advancement depended on imperial favor, political alliances, fertility, and survival. Survival mattered enormously. Palace politics could be vicious. Concubines competed for influence. Eunuchs controlled information. Court factions maneuvered constantly. Mistakes carried enormous consequences. Cixi proved exceptionally intelligent. In 1856, she gave birth to a son, the future Tongji Emperor. This transformed her status immediately. Producing a male heir elevated a concubine's political importance dramatically in imperial systems. Then, disaster struck the empire. The Taiping Rebellion exploded across China during the 1850s and 1860s. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a man who believed himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the Taiping movement combined religious mysticism, social revolution, anti-Qing nationalism, and apocalyptic ideology. The result became one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. Entire cities were destroyed. Agricultural systems collapsed. The Qing government nearly fell. At the same time, China faced foreign military pressure from Britain and France during the Second Opium War. The Xianfeng Emperor fled Beijing in 1860 as Anglo-French troops advanced. foreign soldiers looted and destroyed the magnificent old summer palace, one of the greatest acts of cultural destruction of the 19th century. The emperor died the following year. Suddenly, Cixi found herself mother of the child emperor. This created opportunity. Through political alliances, strategic manoeuvring, intelligence, and remarkable determination, Cixi emerged as co-regent for the young Tongji emperor. Over time, she consolidated extraordinary power. For nearly half a century, she dominated Qing politics from behind the throne. Technically, women were not supposed to rule directly in Confucian imperial ideology. Practically, Cixi ruled anyway. Her political survival skills were formidable. She navigated court coups, reform movements, foreign crises, internal rebellions, and competing factions while maintaining authority in a deeply patriarchal political system. She also cultivated imperial luxury carefully. And among her greatest personal passions were dogs. The breed most closely associated with Cixi was the Pekingese. Pekingese dogs occupied a special place in Chinese imperial culture long before Cixi's lifetime. According to legend, the breed originated from a lion shrinking himself out of love for a tiny marmoset monkey. Chinese mythology and symbolism frequently linked lions with protection, dignity, and imperial authority. Actual lions were not native to most of China by the imperial period, but artistic and religious depictions of guardian lions became enormously important. The Pekingese, with its flowing mane-like fur and proud posture, resembled a miniature lion. This symbolism mattered. Imperial China associated certain animals closely with rank, fortune, cosmology, and spiritual protection. Dragons symbolized the emperor. Phoenixes symbolized the empress. Cranes represented longevity. Tigers represented martial strength. Dogs sometimes represented guardianship and loyalty. The Pekingese became especially associated with the imperial court. For centuries, these dogs were bred within palace environments and guarded carefully. Commoners could face punishment for stealing or mistreating imperial dogs. European visitors encountering Pekingese during the 19th century became fascinated by them. The dogs looked unlike most European breeds. They possessed flattened faces, flowing coats, compact bodies, and immense confidence entirely disproportionate to their size. This confidence remains one of the breed's defining characteristics. A Pekingese often behaves less like a pet and more like an aristocrat, temporarily tolerating household staff. Cixi adored them. Her dogs reportedly lived in lavish comfort within the palace. Eunuchs and attendants cared for them attentively. Some accounts describe silk cushions, specialized diets, and careful grooming routines. The imperial court operated through ceremony and hierarchy in every detail. Even the dogs reflected status. Different breeds and animals carried symbolic associations throughout Chinese history. The broader Chinese relationship with animals was complex and deeply shaped by philosophy, religion, practicality, and folklore. Confucianism emphasized hierarchy, social order, duty, and moral behavior. Taoism often emphasized harmony with nature and spiritual balance. Buddhism influenced attitudes toward compassion and living creatures. At the same time, practical realities shaped animal use. Oxen worked fields. Horses served armies. Dogs guarded homes. Cats controlled rodents. Songbirds became popular pets. Crickets were kept for entertainment. Chinese elite culture also developed sophisticated traditions involving gardens, birds, fish, and ornamental animals. Scholar officials sometimes kept carefully cultivated natural spaces meant to encourage contemplation and artistic refinement. Animals appeared constantly in Chinese painting, poetry, and symbolism. Dogs themselves occupied varied positions in Chinese history. Some regions valued dog meat historically. Others treasured dogs as companions or guardians. Mythology included important canine figures. Folk traditions assigned spiritual significance to certain animals. Imperial lapdogs represented luxury and refinement specifically. The Qing court itself maintained elaborate rituals surrounding imperial life. Court dress regulations specified colours, fabrics, insignia, and jewellery according to rank. Ceremonies governed audiences, meals, festivals, and official interactions. Even movement through palace spaces reflected hierarchy. Cixi mastered this environment. Foreign observers often underestimated her because she was a woman operating within a court system unfamiliar to Europeans. This proved unwise. She survived while numerous male rivals did not. Western accounts of Cixi during the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently portrayed her as either dangerously manipulative or extravagantly decadent. Some criticisms reflected genuine political disagreements. Others reflected racism, sexism, imperial rivalry, or sensationalism. Modern historians increasingly present a more balanced view. Cixi certainly could be authoritarian, politically ruthless, and resistant to reforms she viewed as threatening. But she also supported certain modernization efforts, including railways, arsenals, diplomatic reforms, and limited educational changes. The Qing Empire's problems were enormous and deeply structural. No individual ruler could easily solve them. Meanwhile, the palace dogs continued living remarkable lives. Cixi reportedly gave names to many of her favourite dogs and spoke affectionately about them. Hailing and Shadza became especially noted among accounts from palace insiders and foreign visitors. Foreign women visiting the Qing court sometimes received Pekingese dogs as gifts. This became historically significant. In 1860, during the looting of the Old Summer Palace by British and French troops, several Pekingese dogs were discovered and taken to Europe. One famously survived beside the body of an imperial princess who apparently chose death rather than capture. The dog was eventually presented to Queen Victoria and named Luti. The name remains astonishingly blunt. 19th century imperialism occasionally abandoned subtlety altogether. The arrival of Pekingese dogs in Europe transformed the breed's international popularity. Soon, aristocrats and wealthy families across Britain and beyond desired these former imperial companions. The dogs became fashionable symbols of exotic luxury. Back in China, however, the Qing dynasty faced increasing catastrophe. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 ended in humiliating Chinese defeat. Japan emerged as a rising modern power. The Qing state appeared weak. Reformers demanded modernization. Conservatives resisted. Foreign powers expanded influence. Missionaries spread Christianity. Anti-foreign resentment intensified. Then came the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were a nationalist anti-foreign movement combining martial arts traditions, spiritual beliefs, anti-Christian violence, and anti-imperial anger. In 1900, the movement exploded into widespread conflict. Cixi eventually supported the Boxers against foreign powers. This decision proved disastrous. An international alliance invaded Beijing. The imperial court fled the capital. The Qing government suffered another humiliating defeat. And even amid these crises, stories about Cixi's fluffy companions persisted. Foreign observers often focused on them as symbols of supposed imperial decadence. This interpretation was somewhat unfair. European royalty and aristocracy also pampered pets extravagantly. 19th century elites across the world adored lapdogs. Queen Victoria loved dogs. Russian nobles also loved dogs. Even French aristocrats loved dogs. Humans with enormous wealth have historically displayed remarkable consistency when presented with tiny fluffy animals. Still, the image of palace dogs inside the Forbidden City while the empire struggled politically became powerful symbolism. Cixi herself died in 1908. The Qing dynasty collapsed only 3 years later during the Revolution of 1911. More than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China came to an end. The Forbidden City eventually transformed from imperial palace into historical monument. And the Pekingese dogs of the Qing court became global companions. Today, the breed still carries traces of its imperial origins. Pekingese remain dignified, stubborn, self-assured, and curiously regal despite their size. Many owners eventually conclude they are not truly keeping a dog. They are serving a retired emperor. The story of Cixi and her dogs reveals something important about historical animals. Pets often survive in memory because they illuminate the private humanity of powerful figures. Political leaders become symbols easily. Empress, tyrant, reformer, reactionary. But then history quietly adds another detail. She adored tiny dogs. She worried about them. She named them. She carried them through palace gardens while diplomats argued about the fate of empires. Suddenly, the historical figure becomes more complicated. Cixi ruled during one of the most turbulent periods in Chinese history. She navigated rebellion, imperialism, modernization, political intrigue, and dynastic collapse. And through it all, little palace dogs trotted beside the last great ruler of Imperial China.